On the 20th of December 1909, the Volta cinema opened in Dublin. It was known as the Cinematographique Volta, and it was the first dedicated cinema to open in Dublin. Now, there had been other projections done, but only on an ad hoc basis. But the brainchild of the operation was Mr. James Joyce, the famous writer. He was pretty much unknown at the time. He was only about 27 years of age, and he had come to Ireland with a business project because he hoped to set up a cinema in Dublin, because his money was very scarce in Trieste, supporting his partner Nora and his 2 young children. So he thought that if he could get a cinema up and running in Dublin, it would be a good business venture. He brought 2 Italian technicians over with him, a Mr. Novak and a Mr. Lesnarden. And in the course of his stay here, he interviewed people for the cinema. Eventually he chose number 45 Mary Street, which is just around the corner here, and it was an ironmonger's originally. But having interviewed a number of people, my grandfather Lenny Collins, who had just come out of his time as a young electrician, was interviewed by Joyce, and being a very outward man and very sociable, he got the job, particularly because he had a smattering of French, which he had learnt at Christian Brothers in James's Street, which was invaluable in talking to the 2 technicians who couldn't speak a word of English. So the cinema opened. My grandfather got the job as projectionist, and it opened on the 20th of December. The building was resplendent in a crimson colour and a light blue, and there was great interest in it. There were queues outside. They even advertised for it by having sandwich men, like living advertisements, walking around with Volta on their placards. There were tickets given out. There were handouts given to the people, because most of the films were Italian or French. Beatrice Cenci being one, The Enchanted Palace being another one, Deviled Crab, and of course you also had the comedian, Chaplinesque comedian Tontonini. So it was a great success at the beginning. Now, I've often asked my grandfather what Joyce was like, what sort of a man he was, and he didn't know who he was at the time, because my grandfather was a young man and Joyce was a young man also. He hadn't been celebrated. So my grandfather described him as a tall, thin, soft-spoken man, very retiring. He took a back seat. He was never at the cutting edge of the developments there. But he did remember an argument or a conversation that he had with them, and this was to do with the sandwich men, the walking advertisements. And some of the staff there said, this must be very demeaning to be walking around with a placard on you. And Joyce's response to that was, he said that it doesn't matter how menial the work is, there's more integrity in menial work than there is in doing nothing. Later on, if we look at Ulysses, we'll find that the sandwich men appeared in it as an advertisement for Healy's of Dame Street. Joyce went back about 7 months later, and the cinema was then taken over by the British Provincial Cinema Company. It remained in Dublin until about 1948, originally seating something like 600 and then reverting to 400. And later on, in the 1970s, my grandfather was discovered as having been the projectionist for Joyce, and Liam O'Leary, the famous film archivist, had him open his exhibition Cinema Ireland in 1976. He was also discovered by Joycean scholars such as David Norris. He came out of the limelight in his retirement. He was in his 80s at that stage, and he said it's like the resurrection, he said, being discovered in his 80s. He was interviewed by CBS, BBC, Frank Hall of RTE. He was even asked later on, a few years later in 1979, to open Bloomsday, which he did. And his name is up in the Joyce Tower at Sandy Cove, and it has Lenny Collins, projectionist in the Volta and student of the Master. Later on, I was asked by Nuala O'Phelan, who was a former lecturer of mine, the late Nuala O'Phelan, if I would consider writing a poem, because I was writing poems at that stage, about the notion of projection and cinema as a type of metaphor. So I wrote a poem in celebration of my grandfather's time in the Volta, and it was called Lenny and Joyce, and it goes as follows. He always spoke of how he worked with Joyce, learning his up-and-coming trade. A liberties man, he knew his pictures well and spooled them to the full. As I serve my time, I hear the man in the box drawl Joyce into my ear, and I project the unbroken beam over the faceless crowd onto the page.